So we've looked at a few things in this chapter so far, and I'd like to continue that this time yet. So already we have looked at verse 4, where we discussed about the rock that followed them was Christ, and because the rock was a representation of Christ, how Moses striking that rock then was such an offense. In verse 7, we had looked at that as well, the idolatry at Sinai, at which time the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play around the golden calf. We had looked at verse 9 about the manna, and in that Israel was, as 1 Corinthians 10 says, tempting Christ because of their grumbling, which was in effect a complaint against the sufficiency of Christ. And then the last time we had discussed the doctrine of Balaam out of verse 8, whereby Israel was defeated due to their sexual immorality. And if you'll recall, the doctrine of Balaam is the premise that if you can't curse them, as Balaam was unable to do, then he would corrupt them. And in that he had done that with the Moabites and the Midianites. So we're going to look at we're going to look at three verses today, verses 11, 12, and 13. And here Paul gives a little bit of a summary, I think it is, of what he's taking from these examples that have been given to us. So we're reading here in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11, 12, and 13. And Paul says, "Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it." So a few things stand out here, and we're going to take a verse at a time. In verse 11, it says, "These all happen as examples." And so therefore, as it says, these were written for our admonition. This is our Bible, the perspective that we own, that we're exclusively New Testament Christians, I think forgets the idea or forgets the fact that the Bible to Paul and to the apostles was in fact the Old Testament. And so we're privileged, as was Paul here, in looking at these examples that are instruction for us today. All right, verse 12, I'd like to spend a little bit more time on this. Verse 12, it says, "Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest we fall." I think sometimes we can get the idea that as New Testament Christians that we're more spiritual, more advanced, we're at less risk spiritually of falling. We might look at what they did and say, well, we would never act like that. We're on a higher plane, and hopefully that's true. However, the apostle says, "Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall." And if we just back up a few verses, actually the verse just prior to 1 Corinthians 10, which is the last verse of chapter 9, verse 27, Paul says that he himself thinks that he could do all this ministry as he's doing. He could preach to others and in the end become disqualified. And therefore he says that he disciplines his body and he brings it into subjection, lest, as he says, when I have preached to others, I myself should be disqualified. So even the Apostle Paul thought that there's a possibility that he himself could, like happened here, that he could fall into sin. And all right, so I'd like to think about how in the spiritual journey that we have this analogy here. We're happy when we see people that leave Egypt, people that are baptized and they're on the journey. And I think that we need to temper our excitement about that with the realization that there's also a risk here that the person is not necessarily predestined to continue in that way. In Numbers, it records how it wasn't long after they had crossed the Red Sea that they began to think back to where they had come from. And they said, who's going to give us meat to eat? We remember the fish that we freely ate in Egypt, and the cucumbers, and the melons, and the leeks, and the onions, and the garlic. And that experience there led to many repeated warnings in Scripture about not returning to Egypt. And we have that in Deuteronomy. Isaiah talks about it. Jeremiah talks about it. Hosea talks about it. And I think Galatians may also perhaps allude to that in the New Testament, where Paul says that we got to be careful that we're not again enslaved. And I think he's looking at some imagery there of potentially returning to Egypt. And all these passages, in effect, are saying, don't go back. This is intended to be a one-way street. The only reason they're saying don't go back is because there's a possibility of going back. Our friends who believe in unconditional eternal security would want us to think that once the journey has begun, that it's got an inevitable end. But I don't think that's what we see here at all in 1 Corinthians 10. These things are given as admonitions, as warnings, that those who, as Paul said in verse 1, he says, I don't want you to be unaware of this, that our fathers who were under the cloud, they passed through the sea, they were baptized, but he says most of their carcasses fell in the wilderness. And so I think that's perhaps a text here that is underappreciated in that discussion, and something that we would do well to use in these conversations regarding unconditional eternal security. So if we intend to attain the promised land, then we need to heed how to walk where we are today. All right, and then moving on to verse 13. So we looked at 11 and 12, and now in verse 13, he says that there's no temptation taking you but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted above what you are able, but with the temptation also make a way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. And this is simply a promise that victory is possible, that we do not need to be as those who fell in the wilderness. Even though the majority did, there's no determination in place that we need to fall in the wilderness. We have the ability, like Joshua and Caleb, to make it to the promised land. And so what is the strategy to make it? If we're going to be like Caleb and Joshua, what do we need to do to ensure that victory? Well, I think it kind of goes without saying that we need to believe and realize that victory is possible, that in fact there is no temptation taken us, but such as is common to man. Like all the temptations that those who fell in the wilderness had were also experienced by Joshua and Caleb. They likewise had those same experiences, those same temptations, but they chose a different way. And so we don't need to resign ourselves to thinking that that is impossible or something like that. Many times people find themselves in cycles of defeat, and if that's where we are, then I think we need to understand that doesn't need to continue, that we don't need to be in this place, that failure is not inevitable. We should not give up because we think it's not working for us. It worked for Joshua and Caleb, and therefore it demonstrates that it is possible. And probably worse than any of those wrong responses would be to blame God for our lack of victory, and say, if God wanted me to be walking in victory, then He would do something for me. He would, I wouldn't be in this place if He actually cared about me. So I think that is very wrong-headed, and I think we need to identify those types of wrong thinking in our lives. And then another thing that I think is interesting is here in verse 13, it says that the Lord will, with the temptation, also make a way of escape. And that language of escape, I think, is interesting. I think it's the nature of overcoming. The nature of overcoming is by escaping temptation. It's by fleeing. It's by running away from it. If you just imagine that you see a lion coming, what's the best thing to do? Is the best thing to say, okay, I'm going to go fight this lion, or do we run for safety? We run in the house or something, right? And yeah, so I think that when people talk about fighting temptation, no doubt they're well-intentioned, but it's not the language of Scripture. 2 Timothy says that we should flee youthful lusts. And even the Lord's Prayer is a prayer that we're not led into temptation. Likewise, Jesus used very similar language just before his crucifixion. When he told his disciples, he said, pray that you may not enter into temptation. And 1 Corinthians here, we're in the same book, a few chapters earlier, Paul is speaking about sexual immorality, and he says, flee sexual immorality. He doesn't use the language of fighting it or overcoming it in some way, but uses the language of fleeing. Sirach says that we should flee from sin as we would from the presence of a snake. And so I think that the same is applicable for us today, to recognize that these are not experiences that we need to fight through, but we need to find ourselves in a place where we're not susceptible, and that is to flee from the temptation. So the devil presents himself as an angel of light, and that's also taken from actually 2 Corinthians. The devil presents himself as an angel of light, and that's an attractive image. It's not like some kind of a scary scene or something like that. And in that way, the lion analogy is not a great one, because in fact, if we would always recognize temptation as a lion, we probably would flee it. But instead, it looks like something attractive. And I think the same thing is true today. If we think of temptations that we're faced with, whatever that temptation might be, but maybe using the example of sexual immorality, it's notable that those temptations come to us as something attractive, something desirable, like an opportunity. And I think that's what we see also in the example of Eve, where Eve was in the garden, and this temptation that came to her was of something desirable. This fruit, whatever the fruit was, the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and it was pleasant to the eyes, and it was a tree desirable to make one wise. So these temptations don't come to us as something scary, and they don't look like the danger that they truly are. And so Eve, she stood there and considered it and ultimately took it. But then we also have the good example of Joseph, who saw a temptation that no doubt also looked desirable. But what did he do? He said, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And so what did he do? He didn't fight it. He fled. He ran away, literally, from that temptation. And I think that is what was happening here in Israel's experience. The temptations they had in the wilderness were temptations that were desirable. And that's why they looked back to Egypt and they said, oh, think about the things that we're missing out on. The cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the garlics and the onion and so on. They thought about those desirable things, but as the way of the devil is, does not present all the undesirables that accompany Egypt. They didn't remember the slavery. They didn't remember the tyranny of Pharaoh. You can see this in the advertising today. It's like out on Interstate 90, Mass Pike here, we have this billboard for the casino in Springfield, and it says that this is where winners play. I think that's the words, this is where winners play. But they fail to mention that this is where all the losers are playing too, right? You know? It's like we should be thinking about that when we have desires for for the things of Egypt, that, you know what, this is also, even though that's where the leeks and the garlics are, that's also where the slavery is, and the whips that come over our backs. So Scripture provides us good and bad examples. And 1 Corinthians 10 here that we've been looking at now for 5 weeks is giving us the bad example of something to flee from, to learn from, and to do otherwise. And so may we, like Joshua and Caleb, attain the promise by our faithfulness